So, dear all, I want to start by saying thank you to the coordinators of the Crisis of Expert Knowledge and Authority group for giving me the chance to present my work, and I'm looking forward to hearing your feedback. Today, I want to talk about something that I consider a fascinating history of something that on surface looks like a story of scientific innovations and enlargement of university curriculum, but in essence is a story about manipulation of knowledge and about scholars themselves trying to promote their own ideology using the cover of science. So the guiding premise of this cluster is how to recognize experts and how to prevent erosion of citizens' trust. Well, it wouldn't be really incorrect to say that the people I will talk about today, well, they were experts in recognizing the importance of expertise for gaining the public trust. So they never aimed at being honest brokers between accumulated knowledge and citizen. Rather, as I'll show you, they hoped to sway citizens' political outlook. And the most important weapon in their arsenal was their claim that their conclusions were based on cold logic of science. So you might wonder, and some have already asked, why I start this presentation with graphic depiction of Britain, literally sitting on the world. And as I'll demonstrate, these innovations were above all made in order to convince the public in Britain about the seminal importance of the empire. So today I will talk about institutionalization of 4 different new disciplines. To sum up, basically, around 1890, there were no university chairs, no lectures, no courses dealing with geography, imperial history, economic history, or international relations in all of Great Britain. By 1920, this was no longer the case. I argue that a very small group of like-minded individuals was behind this rather large expansion of social sciences complex. So what I want to show is that these disciplines were oriented toward a particular set of problems because of the audiences they hoped to affect. So there are 2 kinds of arguments that are used to justify writing of disciplinary histories. One, so-called endogenous kinds of arguments, state the benefits for discipline under discussion. But I find more interesting the other one, exogenous, that in a way points that the study of social sciences allows us to see this moment where science meets politics, when academia encounters state interest, and we have the point where knowledge, power, and institutions are actually one place. So how I actually came to study this. Now you can see this whole map of the British Empire in 1886. So initially, I was interested in how territorial separation, either physical or administrative, affected separatism within empires, and how empires attempted to solve the issue. And this is why I studied what was called Federalism in the British Empire, an idea that emerged in 1880s. On this map, you can see that everything is colored red, entire British Empire. But in essence, within the empire, there was a mixture of all kinds of different bonds, and autonomous parts of the empire actually were gaining more and more autonomy. For instance, Canada had a right to make international treaties on its own. Australia started to make its own navy, and for a group of individuals started to think it's not really sustainable. And they advocated something they call imperial federation. So a year into my research, I realized that without exception, the people I found in the archives were involved in various activities that were connected with educational reforms. So I soon realized that the real topic is not federalism, but federalists. So not the idea, but the people. So as I said, the reason that made them desire change in imperial system was they were convinced that this kind of imperial structure was leading towards collapse. And they perceived many dangers on the horizon for the empire. So these dangers were both external and internal. So firstly, Britain experienced relative decline. In other words, British economic growth was stable, British shipping governed world trade, and London was the financial capital of the world. but others were catching up fast. Dangers were also internal. Above everything else, working class was slowly moving towards greater political influence. General suffrage was on the horizon in Britain, labor movement was gaining influence, and the question was, what will be the attitude of the working classes towards the empire? So for the people I encountered, the question was how to pacify the working class, but also how to inform everyone else of paramount importance of the empire for both British security and economic well-being. So the empire faced numerous problems, but in the eyes of these people I also call disciplinary pioneers, there was a solution, imperial reform, that would tie different parts of the empire into a closer union. So some of the guiding questions and a bit about how I approach this methodologically. I use the words such as creation, establishment, or foundation of a discipline, but this does not mean I'm looking for one particular moment in time when a discipline is created. I do not assume that there is no discipline and then professorship is created and we have a discipline suddenly. Instead, I look into these creations of chairs and professorship, so neither as beginnings nor ends of a process, but as a window of opportunity for us to see what sort of conditions created demands for academic innovations and this kind of professionalization. So these moments of creation are important because creators have the chance to push a discipline in one out of many possible directions. And if there is one thing I would like you to remember for the rest of the talk is that British historian Michael Bentley defined knowledge as paradigms of what was and what was not to count as worth knowing. And that is important for what I want to talk about today. So these new disciplines, they promoted imperial reform in the sense that they produced conclusions that justified calls for a change. And as a consequence of this, I think this is the whole reason why professionalization happened. These disciplines were not confined within the walls of universities. They attempted to establish contact with the elites, but above all, to be given institutional means of reaching and influencing the general population. So my first case study today is geography. When it comes to other disciplines, their creation was product of a group. But when it comes to geography, there is only one single individual who made a difference. When we talk about British geography, there is time before and time after Alfred Mckinder. Mckinder institutionalized geography as an independent discipline. As a result of his efforts, the first readership in geography was established at Oxford University in 1887. This talk will be heavily saturated with the specialized vocabulary of the British educational system. Bear with me, I'm sorry about that. So readership in geography was the first academic post dedicated to geography in Britain. Britain's first school of geography was inaugurated in October 1899, again in Oxford, and again Mckinder was the driving force of the project and the first director. So the transformation he helped was substantial. According to his own testimony, his first lecture on geography was attended by an audience of 3. And 3 decades later, geography was taught across British universities and became an important part of elementary and high school curriculum. Here we can see Mckinder with the staff of Oxford School of Geography in 1901. So what drove Mckinder? What motivated institutionalization? In other words, why Mckinder did not want to be only innovative when it comes to the field of ideas, but he also wanted to enlarge the academic complex. So we should not forget that at the time, there are many geographical societies in Britain. So Mckinder was moving geography away from being activity revolving around different societies towards something that was being taught at universities. So I think there are a few reasons that pushed Mckinder towards this kind of thinking. So he was convinced that the world was entering a new era, which was characterized by a few key novelties. Firstly, and most importantly, due to technological developments, mainly Asian continental railroads, build-up, and telegraphy, the world became smaller. The space was shrinking. So continental hinterlands, rich with resources, became accessible. And this disturbed the balance between sea and land-based empires. So British Empire, completely oriented towards seas, was not suited for this change. It could not access the newly available richness of the continental hinterlands. This is the most famous map Mckinder ever made. He labeled it natural seats of power. And a pivot area was actually an area that if one single power got hold of it, it would enable global domination because the richness of the resources located there. So if you pay attention, neither a single part of the pivot area was inside of British possessions, nor Britain could in any near future hope to gain access to it by force. Moreover, the age of exploration was over, so everything was discovered in the world. So why this was important? So the fact that there were no uncharted areas of the world to explore and to divide meant that the great powers could not export conflict somewhere on the periphery. They could not settle issues simply by carving some kind of newfound land. And full-blown out war between great powers became much more likely. So New Age required a new kind of geography that was made to be within university. Idea was that geography is made within universities, but not to stay there. So why universities? So this is a letter that Mckinder sent to the president of the Royal Geographical Society, who actually gave the money for the creation of School of Geography in Oxford. And I'll just read the first sentence, the first underlined sentence. Mckinder said, quote, "School of schools, especially the great public schools, will never take up serious study of geography until it has been proved that it can be made a consistent intellectual discipline." So what was Mckinder was saying? If geography is to be part of elementary and high school education, there is a need to raise the reputation of the subject by studying it at the university level. So in the last sentence that I underlined here, you can see that if geography was to be a serious study, there was a need to have a place where a man or woman may devote 1 or 2 years to study it, actually. So in order to have geography in schools, he wanted geography in universities. So he hoped to make geography an obligatory school subject. And when he did that, he actually changed what he was writing about. So these are the covers of some of the popular books, let me call them that way, that Mckinder wrote. So he started writing these books only after geography became part of school curriculum. So why schools in a way? Why he wanted to affect students, elementary school pupils and high school students? So as a consequence of the Representation of the People Act in 1884, the electorate was considerably increased in Britain. So therefore, Mckinder believed it was of essential value to influence the thinking of the working classes. And he was aware that good education was reserved for the upper classes. He was the son of a physician, and he vividly remembered and talked about how he visited poor working class families together with his physician father. So his geography was supposed to emphasize feeling of knowing and loving Britain. But this love was not about love for its own sake. Mckinder talked about manpower. His reasoning was that the true power of a nation lay in its human resources. So the population ought to receive better healthcare to enjoy higher life standard, but also to get better education. And the proper policies that Britain should adopt, according to Mckinder, were the ones that aimed towards greatest amount of manpower. So that power was some physical, intellectual, and moral qualities of a population. So geography was there to affect virility and morale. So he aimed to swing public opinion towards position with more understanding for the value of the empire. And above all, he aimed to achieve this by influencing how people think about space. And in a rare moment of honesty, now please take a look in the middle passage here. In a rare moment of honesty, Mckinder explained that his science was not always really aiming to benefit everyone. As he said, this is taken from a lecture to the group of geography teachers. Teaching geography in schools is to deviate from cold and impartial ways of science. When we teach minions, we're not training scientific investigators, but the practical striving citizens of the empire. So Mckinder introduced this globalist geographical thinking because he hoped to conveyed the message that the world was interconnected and that without the empire, Britain would simply collapse. And this is the last one I want to show, the last passage I want to take from Mckinder's writing, is he wanted to make people think geographically. And he said, the special virtue of thought by visualization is that it prompts doing rather than merely knowing. And I find this last part quite fascinating. So by geography, Mckinder said, I do not intend a knowledge of place names. I do not even mean a knowledge chiefly of facts. So geographical education was there in a way to support Britain. Firstly, to convey the message to the population that Britain will lose its power without the empire, but also in a way to raise the virility of its population. The second part, the second case study, is about economic history. So the story about the emergence of economic history takes us a bit further into the past, just so that we understand what was the position of economic sciences within the universities. So already from the 1820s, study of what was called political economy started within universities. However, these positions did not require that their incumbents do a substantial amount of work. Lack of stable finances behind these chairs meant they were often unoccupied. And especially the important thing to know is that during late 18th and the first half of the 19th century, the most influential economists, they were not associated with universities. So if you think about John and James Stuart Mill, David Ricardo, or Adam Smith, they were not affiliated with universities. So that kind of affiliation was neither considered prestigious nor necessary. And this was beginning to change in the second part of the 19th century. By 1870s, there was a growing interest for the study of political economy within universities. But the thing was that political economy did not exist independently. So the chair that you were able to see on the slide before, in Oxford, political economy was in institutional sense part of the school of modern history. In other words, historians were in charge of what was to be defined as political economy at the time. In Cambridge, political economy was it was divided between historical tripos and moral sciences tripos. That moral sciences tripos was what is now called Department of Philosophy. So now I want to show you this. This is Google Ngram data about usage of the words political economy and economics. So Google Ngram data shows that the usage of the word economics and English language literature overtook the usage of the political economy at some point around 1905. So this is interesting because around the same time, the story I want to tell ends. So in 1903, after much careful planning and work, Alfred Marshall, one of the most influential economists of the time, created economic tripos at Cambridge. It was first course of study dedicated solely to the economics from beginning to end. 1 year later, in 1904, Lillian Knowles became the first lecturer of economic history in Britain, based at the London School of Economics. So the fact that economic history emerged precisely in that year is by no means an accident, and other economic history positions followed soon. So my goal is to explain and understand what actually happened between 1870s and 1903-4. So the story of economic history is similar to other newly established disciplines under discussion today in two important aspects. Firstly, the fear of declining empire was one of the prime drivers of innovation. Secondly, what pioneers of economic history actually studied was dictated by the audiences they attempted to reach. However, the story of economic history in the context of my today's talk is unique in two ways. Firstly, unlike other three disciplines that emerged unopposed, there were, for instance, no two ideas how imperial history should look like. There was only one. The birth of economic history was marked by furious academic debates. And unlike creators of geography, imperial history, and international relations, the founders of economic history did not initially want to create a separate field. They have only done it after their original goal failed. And that goal was to change contemporary economic dogmas through history of economic thought. So the institutional birth of economic history was almost accidental side effect of the failed attempt to use history of the economic thought to challenge contemporary policies. Economic thinking in 1880s and 1890s in Britain was, apart from other things, marked by a conflict between two groups. One side emerged victorious. I study and today talk about the other side, the side that lost. So I can introduce my main protagonists of my story, three Williams. Well, one way of introducing them would be to say that neither one of them actually achieved what they wanted, and that is to occupy the most prestigious academic positions in Britain at the time. William Cunningham was beaten by Alfred Marshall when he applied for a political economy professorship in Cambridge. William Hughes, for a while, even lectured for no fee at Oxford, and William Ashley never got German professorship of political economy in Oxford. So you may think places, they were simply not good enough, but that's not the story. This is not about meritocracy. One member of Alfred Marshall's circle, Herbert Foxwell, proudly wrote in 1890, and I quote, "Half of the economic chairs in the United Kingdom are occupied by Marshall's pupils," end of quote. When Alfred Marshall went into retirement in 1908, everyone expected that Foxwell will be his successor. But in the previous years, in the years previous to 1908, Foxwell changed his opinion about the most important question that in the end divided two groups. And that question was, should Britain continue with the free trade or turn to protections? And because Foxwell changed his opinion, Marshall personally made sure that he was succeeded by someone else, at the time much younger and not that experienced, Arthur Pigou. So what drove this group that I call accidental founders of economic history? In their writings, the main target of their attacks was what they called harmful economic orthodoxy. Well, what economic orthodoxy is of course debatable, but I will just stick to what it was for them. It was abstract, ahistorical, mathematical economics, and the main problem with it was that this kind of economics was not only uninterested in reform, social or imperial, but it was a hindrance to it. So the first reason, if we go through their writings and we see the hierarchy of their reasoning, well, the first reason that prompted chronologically this challenge was the conviction that the free trade approach had harmful societal consequences. So modern capitalism was inhumane, and it was seen as a paradox that Britain was the richest country in the world, but the third of its population lived in poverty. But the reason was not just altruism, and just like in Mckinder's case, individualistic approach to economics was dangerous because it destabilized societies and makes social conflict possible. So there is a strong conservative anti-individualist note here. And for my protagonist, society was not just a collection of individuals, but an organism of connected units. And as you will see, social Darwinism is all over my talk today. The second cause for attack, the one that gave theoretical coherence, was the influence of German school of historical economics. What made German school so appealing? Well, apart from the fact that Germany at the time showed immense economic growth and very progressive social legislation, German economics was marked by its anti-cosmopolitanism, at least in the interpretation of their British readers. And the third reason, and I would say the main one, was the empire. So from the 1880s onwards, economists started to write much more about the empire than before. There is visible, clear imperial anxiety and omnipresent concern what will actually happen with the empire in the future. So the first two reasons were strong motives, and they chronologically come first, but it seems that the empire was in a way driver of this call of the change. And we can note the desire to create an economics that would serve the needs of the empire. So William Hughes, whose photo you saw a few minutes ago, he wrote an entry about economics for the Encyclopedia Britannica. And this is, you can see what he wrote. He said, Public policy requires closest possible study of the economic forces which are molding the destinies of the great nations of the world. And these great nations, in other words, British competitors, used methods suggested by scientific research. So the simple question of what is economic science was inseparable from the fact that there is a global struggle for supremacy, and in this conflict, states use policies suggested by scientific research. So, if the empire could not afford to ignore economics, how it can help the empire? And this is the reason why they turned towards the past to show how harmful the contemporary free trade approach was. So, economic history emerges with a very specific group of topics. The first one was they tried to understand why great powers of the past failed. So William Cunningham, for instance, wrote a lot about this. And it's interesting that at the time when there's a notion of more united British Empire, which excites imperial imaginations, Cunningham concludes that in the ancient world, city-states failed because they acted individually. The second group of topic was clear rehabilitation of mercantilism and generally the economic thinking of the 17th century. What was appealing to them is, and I'll quote Cunningham now, quote, the English mercantilists were considering how the power of this country might be promoted relatively to that of other nations. The object of the system was not absolute progress anywhere, but relative superiority to our political neighbors. Thirdly, some of them fiercely criticized the classics of political philosophy. So Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations was labeled as a partisan book with an outdated philosophy. The fourth one would be, we can say they were looking for something they called a lost British tradition. They were trying to find new kind of heritage that they can use for the policies they wanted to implement. And fifth, some of them actually tried to reinterpret Adam Smith and the claim that Smith didn't actually say that free trade was cause of prosperity, but that intra-imperial free trade within the empire was the cause of prosperity. So we go to 1903. The year when economic tripos was established was very important for another reason. British economists were not the only ones who argued about the benefits and downsides of the free trade. In 1903, so-called Tariff Controversy erupted. Conservative Party was split on this question, but the main question of political life completely was, should Britain stop being the only great power that has absolutely no import tariffs? And when this, you can see here one of the posters made by the proponents of tariff reform, as you can see, poor British worker coming to the factory, but the factory is closed because there is unfair foreign competition. So what is important is that when tariff controversy erupted, we can see direct contact between political leaders pushing for the protectionism and the protagonists of this story. So I just wanted to show you excerpts from two letters. Andrew Bonar Law, a leading conservative politician who favored the tariff reform, wrote to William Ashley and said, the problem is for a success of tariff reform is that scientific authority is against us. What he wanted to say is that majority of economists were actually against proposals to introduce tariffs. And the leader of the whole movement, Joseph Chamberlain, said to William Hughes, you are the ones, you must supply economic argument. So what happened? Britain did not accept tariffs at this point. Tariff reformers failed. Just like my protagonists failed to change mainstream of economic thinking and also failed to secure prestigious academic positions. But one thing did change. During the whole period from early 1880s onwards, they never thought about themselves as being economic historians, even though their opponents were saying, you're not doing economics, you're doing economic history. However, this began to change slowly in the first years of the 20th century. So I go back to Hughes. Hughes was from 1895 to 1903 director of the London School of Economics. the school that was, apart from other things, created to offer different kind of economic thinking. And during this time, he never pursued economic history in institutional sense at the LSE. Moreover, he attempted to establish a degree for the study of economics. However, what happened in 1903 is that we have almost a convergence of few important events. So we have tariff reform movement started. Marshall creates economic tripos, and Hughes, even he never actually explained why he did this. He decides to create first economic history lectureship at the LSE at the same point when he decided to leave LSE in order to pursue life in politics. So he did something that was brought to fruition by the second director of the London School of Economics, Alfred Mckinder, who actually helped institutionalize the study of economic history. At LSE, they had two candidates. This is again talk about the choice of people in academia was not about meritocracy. Two candidates, Hugh Meredith, who wrote that protection is not really a serious economic solution, and Lillian Knowles, who was described by friends as a violent Tory and ardent imperialist, and who pointed to the tariffs of British competitors and the subsidies they gave in order to bolster their own industries. Well, I don't think I need to tell you that Hugh Meredith didn't get the job, but don't be sad about him. He got the job with Marshall in Cambridge. An important similarity, just for the end, just to see that there is a lot of contact between people creating different disciplines. Hughes was succeeded by Mckinder in 1903. Hughes left LSE to join politics. Well, Mckinder left LSE to join politics in 1908. Hughes left LSE in order to lead Tariff Reform League, a kind of a NGO that aimed to produce statistical material about the importance of tariffs. Well, when Mckinder left LSE in 1908, the official reason was that he was to give statistical ammunition for the reformist imperial cause. The first two chairs in Britain dealing with colonial history or imperial history, these two terms were used interchangeably, were White Professorship of Colonial History created in Oxford in 1805 and Rhodes Professorship created in London in 1919, although Rhodes lectures actually started much earlier. So chronicles of the imperial growth, the tales about missionaries, merchants, and mercenaries that spread British influence around the world have been written well before first years of the 20th century. However, only in the first years of the 20th century, we have attempts to create imperial history as a separate field of historical investigation. And if we follow lines of the pioneers of imperial history, we have an interesting story because there is productive dynamics between the problems they think exists in political life of empire and the orientation of their field. So I want to show that imperial history emerged as a project. There was a high level of coordination between founders. And above everything else, imperial history was imagined as problem-solving discipline. It ought to offer solutions for contemporary problems. So this desire to produce knowledge that would solve problems loomed large about imperial history. So for instance, in 1913, almost as if they had an agreement, and they probably did, but I just couldn't find proof for it, all of them started to use the phrase, the problem of the empire, and they were the ones to solve it. So as you can see, Hugh Egerton, who was the first White professor of colonial history in Oxford, said, well, the problem of the empire is how to secure its permanence. For Charles Lucas, who was the servant of the colonial office and was acting behind the scenes, the problem of the empire is how to hold together lands and peoples which are distant or diverse or both. And for Sidney Lowe, who started the whole project of imperial studies in London, well, it was to deal with the questions that otherwise lead to centrifugal forces of separation. The good thing with British academia is that professors are often asked to give inaugural lecture, which is later published. And these inaugural lectures are a very interesting source. So we can see what was the imperial history for professors of imperial history. So for Egerton, it was to history was there that can help cultivation of historical imagination. For the second by Professor Reginald Copeland, imperial breakdowns happened because no one actually studied how to prevent it. And for Alfred Newton, the first Rhodes Professor of Imperial History, well, the whole popularity of imperial history was in the fact that this kind of history could explain what happened, what can happen in the future. So they thought they knew what the problem was, and they also believed they knew what the cure was. And the cure was dissemination of facts with polemical purpose that ought to canalise behaviour and to cause empathy for the imperialist cause, and to build kind of imperial patriotism. So creation of new institutions was the goal. However, what is interesting to note is that no one ever said we need professorship of imperial history to do imperial history. So writing of imperial history was possible without professorships. So one of the key individuals operating behind the scenes was Lionel Curtis, Bite lecturer in colonial history. Despite his officially low rank, he was the one making all decisions. So you remember how Cunningham claimed that study that collapsed, Empire of the Fast collapsed because city-states failed to combine? Well, there is a good parallel here. Lionel Curtis made a decision to appoint Reginald Copeland as Bite lecturer and later Bite professor because he knew that Copeland, who actually didn't know anything about British Empire because he studied ancient world, claimed that, quote, impermanence of Greek city-states was largely the result of their failure to combine. So what was the role of universities? In a letter to a friend, Lionel Curtis disclosed his vision. And I think this is such a powerful passage, I actually had problems to decide what to underline. What is Curtis is saying here, actually? There should be democracy, but someone should explain to the people what is the actual problem. So people should decide, but someone should put it to them in a way that they can understand. So here we see that professionalization of imperial history was connected with large audiences that could have been targeted through universities. So one thing I need to say to you, historians are now completely irrelevant within universities, but it was a really different a century ago. So according to the data that I was able to find, in 1914 at Oxford, more than a third of students majored in history. Moreover, historians were known for pursuing life in party politics. For instance, one contemporary noted that during Paris Peace Conference, 20% of British diplomatic delegations studied history at the same college in Oxford. So, in the words of the first professor of imperial history, every school building is a citadel of the empire, and every teacher its sentinel. So, the history they produced was meant to act as panacea, as a cure, but medications can have their side effects. And this is the moment where we can see the tension between the goals they wanted to achieve, the message they wanted to convey, and their historiographical output. So the proper historical work was about consolidation of the empire. And in order to do that, well, they talked about some principle of selection. Well, not everything from imperial past was worthy of being preserved and communicated. So the main focus of them was on so-called Imperial Reformers. So they studied people in the past, individuals, who either helped establish relations between metropolis and periphery, or who came up with alternative solutions that were not accepted. And you can see on the slide some of the titles. So these are about individuals who either created colonies, created relations between kind of colony and metropolis, or suggested something that never happened. So imperial history ought to create wide imperial identity. And so there is no doubt about scale of analysis. They were strongly against the histories of separate colonies. And they tried to carve the empire as a historical singularity because it was recognized. Separate histories provoke separate feelings, and that was the last thing they wanted to see. Another consequence is that imperial history was actually the most contemporary history that was made at the time, because historians don't usually study the decades that are close to their moment in time. The reason is lack of sources, and also the idea that there will be no complete objectivity. But imperial historians, the most of the connections they wanted to change were actually being made in the most recent past. So they did the most contemporary history, because at Oxford, no other historians studied moment past Queen Victoria's ascension in 1837. But imperial historians, if they published a book in 1900, the book usually ended with 1900. I will finish with international relations. So historiography that attempts to explain how did international relations emerge is enormous, but I'll try to give a 2-sentence long summary. For a long time, it was understood that discipline was created by people who were shocked by the First World War. And because of these horrors, they wanted war never to happen again. However, during the last 2 decades, we actually know that IR was strongly saturated with imperial imperatives and racial prejudices. So I want to confirm recent historiographical developments, but with special emphasis of a continuation of similar logic behind disciplinary innovation. So international relations emerge from this point of view as a uniquely British product, because in all other cases, geography, economic history, and imperial history, there are studies of these topics elsewhere in the world, in the United States, in Germany, in France. But in Britain, IR is institutionalized before than anywhere else. And I think the reason that this happened the reasons are the following. So 1914 is the year that changed everything. By that point, my protagonist argued that, well, whatever the problem is, the more unified empire is the solution. And during the First World War, this position was abandoned. And I think due to 3 reasons. So firstly, during the First World War, the empire was completely financially drained, and financial and political burden had consequences. Secondly, slowly, and for many imperial patriots, painfully came the realization that financial power of the Wall Street was something that Britain firstly could not possibly hope to match. And it was new kind of asymmetrical financial geometry that meant that international relations will look different. And thirdly, even though many imperial reformers were looking forward to the constitutional convention of the empire scheduled for the 1917, it never happened, because during the conference in 1917, where representatives of different parts of the empire basically said, representatives of Canada, Australia, they said, we will rather choose complete independence than any kind of stronger centralization. So the old idea to salvage the empire through reform did not just make any sense. The empire was not able anymore to fend all opponents on its own, even though if it could unite, and there was no chance of the empire uniting. So the new idea that slowly emerged was to act in the sphere of international. To put it differently, the empire was to be defended by affecting what was happening outside of the empire, not anymore inside of it. So this kind of thinking was encouraged, I think, by the fact that during the war, governments of all sides started to mobilize scientists in unprecedented manner. And they opened parts of the government that were usually closed for scientists. In British case, especially political intelligence department of the Foreign Office mobilized numerous social scientists. And we can see this change, actually best change turning towards international best through the work of Federalist group called the Round Table. The group was created in 1909 with the goal to propagate imperial reform. So the idea was to think about international the international relations in a way that will not challenge what was the most important for the empire. The goal was how to achieve those policies that were favorable for the empire. So the change of global power that was caused by the rise of the United States bring the United States into the picture. Because there was a need to bring some kind of understanding with the United States. But the problem was official anti-colonialism of the US President Wilson. When US ambassador in London said publicly that US can only support politics of self-determination, it was a horror. So these people actually found themselves in a search of some kind of United States they can work with. They hope to establish relations with those groups in American politics with which cooperation was most likely. So, for what happened during the next years, these three individuals bear the most responsibility. You already recognize Curtis, but here you can also see two of his former students, of Imperial History at Oxford, two Americans, George Baer, who was one of the advisors of the President Wilson and the chief US expert for colonial questions in Paris during the peace conference. And on the right, you can see Whitney Shepardson, personal assistant of Colonel Edward House, who was basically the right hand of the President Wilson. So what was important that Curtis never had a shade of doubt about what they think about the British Empire. In 1930 letter to Curtis, Baer declared, as you can see, I regard the permanency of the existing British Empire as a matter of vital concern to the civilization of the world. He said there is identity of purpose between US and British Empire. So if Britain could maintain its supremacy, if Britain couldn't maintain its supremacy, the next best thing was an alliance with another English-speaking power. So during the peace conference, the members of British and US delegation met regularly. On May 30th, 1919, during the meeting at Hotel Majestic, you can see on the photo, Lionel Curtis presented his plans to the members of US and British delegation. He said management of global affairs meant there needs to be some kind of coordination. And the minutes of the meeting state, for this purpose, various bodies of experts in different countries should try to remain in touch with each other. So Curtis talked about unspecified different countries, but in reality, he only had Britain and US in mind. And he proposed that a committee of 3 American and 3 British members be appointed to prepare a scheme for a creation of an Institute of International Affairs. And on this slide, you can see, these are Curtis's words, you can see what was his idea. Well, basically, after they all gathered in Paris, these people can be the most valuable factor in the production of what he called sound public opinion. And unless they are kept in touch together with some kind of institution, their value will deteriorate. So the idea emerged that there should be an institute dealing with international affairs. Goal of Curtis was to create a bond with almost emerging class of experts that will stay in touch with policymakers. So during the war, social scientists entered parts of the government that they were closed for them before, and some of them didn't want to leave. And soon a committee was formed to draft a scheme for this new institute. The writers of the draft were Lionel Curtis and Whitney Shepardson. The name first suggested for the new institution was Institute of International Affairs, founded at the Conference of Paris in 1919. The idea was to create one institute that will have 2 branches, one in the United Kingdom and the other one in the United States. And so this 2-branch vision was not accidental. The whole scheme was created to bring US closer to Britain. So shortly before Second World War, Curtis actually admitted to a friend that what he did with this kind of an institute for international affairs was actually the same thing he was doing before. So what he eventually created was an institute that is now known as Chatham House. And he said, and I quote now, "The foundation of Chatham House was a necessary tactical change to affect the same strategic object. In a way, Britain could not secure the empire just by affecting what is happening inside the empire. Now the term was to set up the terms how the international relations will be. set. So the concept of one institute with two branches was never realized. Curtis continued with his project, and in Britain, he created British Institute of International Affairs in 1920, the Chatham House I mentioned. The Americans, on the other hand, created Council on Foreign Relations. So, in a way, Chatham Houses, these people belong to kind of a group of Americophiles within Britain. They wanted to make a partnership with the US in order to create some kind of Anglo-American world hegemony. And I will stop now the screen sharing so you can actually see me. So some last words. In a way, I think this story is interesting because modern understanding what a discipline is emerges at some point in time, mostly at the time that I talk about, so late 19th century, early 20th century. And what we now consider as a body of knowledge actually emerged in a process of negotiation between overlapping areas of interest, and also it was an ideal moment for someone to set up the initial terms. And I think that for me, the whole story shows how important it is to study this, what sociologists call boundary work. In other words, how you delineate what is science and what is not science, because no one ever claimed I need a chair for economic history in order to be economic historian. It was there in a way because it was used in this battle for hearts and mind. So I have talked a lot using the language of my protagonists without actually engaging with their claims often, so there was just not enough time. They always, I think their language also explains their goal, because they promise something they could never deliver. There is no way they could ever create one sentence law that describes why empires fail. But I think that their language was like that. It was lacking the details. It was more of a collection of prescriptions and prescriptions because they wanted to get public to listen to them. And yes, thank you for your attention. That was everything I wanted to say.
Okay, I guess I'll take charge of the questions here. So let's have the little, if you raise your little hands, your little blue hands, I will call on people. And if I don't, I see Kathleen. Let me just see if there's anybody else raising their hand right away. Kathleen, why don't you go ahead?
Hi, can you hear me okay? Yeah, cool. Thank you. Miloš, thank you. That was so interesting. And there was so much there. I just think it sounds like a really, really fascinating project. I wanted to ask you a little bit about your history of the chair in economics and economic history, and a little bit about what you said about the prehistory of political economy. Because one of the things about political economy as it emerged in the 18th and 19th century is that it's very closely intertwined with moral philosophy. So it's not that it doesn't really exist, it's that it's attached to moral philosophy. So for example, Adam Smith, he did hold a university chair, but it was in moral philosophy, not in political economics. And Jean-Baptiste Say, and for example, all the people that we think of the kind of the big names of political economy, they're also very closely associated with moral philosophy. And I was just wondering if you would have anything to say about why political economics becomes sort of detached from moral philosophy and then attached to history, just because in this period, because I think that's kind of really interesting as to why it kind of jumps from an association with one discipline to an association with another, particularly as you say, these people are claiming to make a kind of a broader point about society, a sort of a broader kind of moralistic point about how society should be formed and should be kept together. So I was wondering if you had anything to say about that. Thank you.
I didn't know that Smith was actually affiliated with the Cambridge in the moral philosophy. Thank you for.
It was his Glasgow, but yeah.
Okay, thank you for pointing that out. So I think the way we can study this is that we can read foundational documents of the. So when a tripos is created, a document is published publicly that describes what is going to be studied. For instance, when in Oxford School of Modern History took over political economy. They, in a way, set the initial questions, what political economy actually studies, and what can be the questions that students will have to deal in order to get a degree. So I don't know how this actually looked like before 1860s and 1870s. Some historians actually say that what is happening can be followed as political economy developing toward like being a umbrella term that incorporates not just one thing, that and that by the time that I talked about it actually develops towards economics and economic history. Sometimes, I mean, it's difficult because somewhere the term political economy was kept just for the sake of tradition. So, but I don't know how to insightfully actually answer your dilemma. I think there's a 1 century of gap between of what you do and what I was trying to get into here.
If I don't see another hand, I will go next. So there was this focus on political economy, but also on history. And from my perspective, there's two rather distinct things going on here. And so the connection between them, or the drift between them, if that's what it was, is a little bit unclear to me. So for example, specifically, you talked about the issue of tariffs and free trade.
Repeat, sorry, I missed the last 10 seconds.
Sorry, you talked specifically about the issue of free trade and tariffs, and you also talked about imperial history. Now, from my perspective, there's not a whole lot of connection between those two topics. The issue of free trade versus tariffs, I mean, there's a lot of been written about that in economics. Very little of it has anything to do with history, right? It's a matter of understanding how economies work, right? And understanding who benefits from protectionist measures and who loses and what the net benefit is. History doesn't really figure into this one way or the other. History, on the other hand, is widely misused in general. And this is what I'm having a hard time distinguishing from your narrative. So every country in the world, at virtually every time period in the world, right? There's a continuum between history and myth, and there's the use of history as myth. Every country has myths about its own history that are designed to reinforce loyalty to the country, social norms to the country, identity with the country, and so forth and so on. It's taught in elementary school, it's taught in kindergarten, it's taught in middle school, it's taught in high school, and it's taught in universities. If you go around and you interview people that grew up in different countries and you ask them what you learned in history, you'll discover that what they learned in history was all a matter of myth. Where was the airplane invented? I could go through long, long lists of things. Every country has their own view of, and for very specific reasons. So why do Greeks worship Alexander the Great, even though there's nobody in Greece today who probably has the least genetic connection to Alexander the Great? It's a matter of myth, right, of the greatness of Greece, and so forth and so on. Because they think about the United States, about any country. So given the widespread use of history as myth, why is it so much different in this university context? It seems to be these particular people had objectives. They wanted to be imperialists. They had particular views about imperialism. And so they selectively interpret history just as everybody else does in order to support their particular view, right? As Henry Kissinger did. I mean, go through, there are many historians who are true historians, but for every historian who's a true historian, there's a myth maker, at least one, maybe 100, right? So this is why I'm having a hard time with your narrative, because I don't see what's so unusual about the fact that there were so many myth makers.
So I understand this question in part, why should we care, kind of a question. And
that's right. It seems to me that this is very much, no. I actually found it quite interesting. Don't get me wrong. What I'm trying to do is to see if you have a distinction here between your imperial historians and economists and other myth makers, for example, the people who taught history at Eton in the UK, who no doubt also had various imperialistic myths as well that they taught as part of history. Is there a distinction here, or are these really acting as agents of the same social norm, of the same class, the same elite?
So I think there are a few things I feel the need to say. So in general, the whole of 19th century considers history to be a reservoir of wisdom. And in this sense, my protagonists are not unique. They are also not unique because they fail in their goal. British Empire collapses. In what they achieved is that they were able to create institutions that every single one of these still exist. And I think that why should we care in a way is also that as disciplinary founders, they were quite successful. And I think that why this my kind of idea to think about audience and think about discipline is useful is that, for instance, I will talk about what you're probably interested the most, the thing about trade. So not all the protagonists I study actually believed that free trade is really bad. But just for the sake of unity inside what was the larger project for them, and that was survival of the empire, they were ready to be silent on this question. So they were ready to act as a group. And in that sense, I think that, as you said, I mean, it was written a lot about this, but in this context, I think we see how, if we take all disciplines chronological, another thing emerges. So it was too early for political economy to have support of South African money, because South African money, Rhodes Trust and Alfred White, who was a diamond tycoon, basically they had the money and they just created Imperial History. That was irrelevant in the beginning, but over time developed to be a quite influential discipline, one of the more present nowadays in historiography. And the same thing is true for international relations. Who gives the money for this? The whole idea of IR institutes. It's again, rich people from South Africa. But for political economy, and when the economic history was being done in order to challenge this, there was no this kind of a support. So I think this actually allows us to see the ways, I mean, potentially, just to think about briefly, if the money was already there, who knows how the tariff reform would turn out in a sense of what would be the accepted policy in 1903 if the scientific authority was there. So yes, I think that was everything I wanted to say. If I remember something else, I'll go back to this.
Let me give other people an opportunity here. I see Leah there. Would you unmute? Leah?
Hi. Hi, Miloš. Good to see you. So we were in the same global history seminar, and I saw kind of Miloš working on his piece. I'm very excited to see now it has some interesting findings. So I have a question about geography. I find this really fascinating because I work on 19th century Russian history. So when you mentioned this natural seats of power map, I saw that he pointed Eurasia as like the sort of pivot area. And I was wondering sort of to what extent the Great Game kind of motivated the study and institutionalization of geography. And of course, this is connected with the imperial anxieties, but it seems to me that it's a bit unclear in your presentation, sort of these two different things. One is the development or institutionalization of geography as just scientific research versus sort of teaching geography in a university as a way to sort of make people to become citizens of the empire. So I see the second one more as some kind of education and fostering imperial identity, whereas the first one more kind of just developing practical tools for, you know, I don't know, mapping out the territory, like for example, cartography or all kind of geosciences. So I guess my question in short is, when you mention geography, what do you mean exactly? Is it like more specific practical knowledge of the earth, or kind of just, oh, this is Asia, this is Africa, and teaching students sort of knowing, having an imagination of the world? So this is the first question. And the second one, I'm just curious about why Mckinder thinks that the pivot area in history is in Eurasia and not in other parts of the world. To what extent this is linked with, you know, in the late 19th century, there were these theories about kind of the origins of human races and the origin of the earth, and they all point to sort of the Himalayas region. So personally, I'm just very interested in kind of the Great Game and the Central Asia, Tibet area, and why people all wanted to go there. So I wonder if you thought about that or have any answers. Yeah, thanks.
Hi, Leah. Good to see you after 2 years almost. So first about Great Game. Yes, it was important in a sense that Mckinder realized that actually in the case of the war between Britain and Russia, Britain was not able to defend northwestern frontier of India. And the fact that there was a rail building project in Asia, that meant that the Russian troops will be more mobile and that Russia will be able to use more resources than it was able to use. So this was a pretty bad development in terms of what British interests were. About your question, what was geography? Well, before Mckinder, if you take a look at Royal Geographical Society, for instance, it's mostly about map making. And Mckinder tries to move geography away from what was physical geography, description of the earth, towards something that was, in his view, he drew mostly from German. He talked about Anthropogeography. So he talked about this geography that tries to inculcate the relations between the individuals and the space, or the spatial characteristics of the space they inhabit. So his grand goal was, in a way, he's considered a founding father of geopolitics. And his goal was to uncover how geography actually acted as a causal aspect in history. So also when we talk about, so you said this difference between development of institutions and teaching of citizens. Well, I tried to show that actually in this, the second thing, the teaching of citizens, actually was one of the causes of professionalization within universities. Because I think we can see this, either they wanted to raise the reputation of the subject like Mckinder, or they wanted to use the chance that universities gave just to be in contact with a lot of people, and especially in that time with the people who will be in some position in the government. And the last thing you asked was about why pivot is in Asia. So initially he said pivot is in Asia, but he changed his view in 1919 after the First World War, and he renamed pivot to heartland. And actually after that, he claimed that Eastern Europe was the key, because in a way, whoever controlled Eastern Europe, either Germany or Russia, would actually later be able to dictate the terms of what will happen with the resources of the Central Asia, because if you lose there, then you will not be able to affect it. And this actually caused a lot of problems for Mckinder's reputation, because this was picked up by Nazi geopoliticians wholeheartedly, and he had to defend himself by the end of his life that he didn't inspire Nazis, actually. So he changed in the end. He said Eastern Europe is the key, and this is why he supported creation of independent nation states in a way to weaker both Russia. He wanted great Ukraine, great Serbia, great Czechoslovakia, to weaker both the German world and the Russian Empire.
That's very fascinating. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, Peter, I think you're next.
Okay, thank you. Look, thank you for a sort of fascinating overview of a lot of different levels of history, really. I mean, there are a lot of threads there. I'm just trying to relate your analysis to what the interests of the group might be, Miloš. And I mean, so first of all, I guess it's a very important reminder, your talk about how disciplinary areas have these very specific histories that we should probably always remind ourselves of. But I mean, your story in part is of people who create these disciplines or help to create these disciplines, and who at the same time are trying to be puppeteers, in a sense, of ideas and of political ideas. So your story about Mckinder is not just the story of a scientist, but someone who is trying to take on this puppeteering role because he fears for the future of the empire, and then begins to introduce these ideas that you talk about. I mean, that there's some sense in which geopolitics is geographically determined. I mean, I'm probably getting that wrong, but that's a one-sentence summary of what I take from your story about Mckinder. And then the story about economic history, your three losers, as it were, seems to be a story of failed puppetry. So, you know, what's a takeaway message here? That experts, when they, as it were, enter these political puppet games, are taking awful risks with the integrity of their discipline. But at the same time, somehow they were successful in the sense of establishing that discipline. But all they really did was to establish a framework which other people then entered and changed, and you know, academic disciplines differentiate in all sorts of ways. So there are a lot of mixed messages potentially from your story about experts. And so I'm wondering if it's possible for you to perhaps try and crystallize some of these messages for us, because you know, you obviously know the micro detail in a way that we don't.
So first of all, you got geopolitics completely correct. That this is what it was. I think I'll try to crystallize on one particular. I mean, it's a difficult question. I'll try to crystallize on one particular example. So when I talked about imperial historians, I didn't really had the time to talk about this. But you said they leave framework that others can enter and change. Well, this is what I disagree with. I don't think it's such an easy thing to change, because some things just continue, and the researchers that come after us can just take it away. I'll give one example. Imperial historians created chronology of the British Empire. They said, before American Revolution, it's first empire. After, there is second. And historians accepted that. You can now buy books published 5 years ago, which have this distinction: history of the first British Empire. And you can see PhD dissertations being written about second British Empire. And also there was a third British Empire. The notion of that started around the end of the First World War. It's one of the names for emerging Commonwealth, the promise, the better version, the new version, and so on. But actually, some historians tried to, in a way, measure it. Is it actually that the year of the American independence is a border? Is there actually a kind of a difference in colonial policies? But it was never, it was intentionally made. It was not a miscalculation to create this chronology. It was made intentionally so they can point to what is good colonial policy, and that is give autonomy so people don't leave you, and what was bad colonial policy. And there was actually, they created the whole, so David talked about this myth creating, but myths being made by historians going to the past. But they made this myth to be used in a way, even though it was just a myth, they were aware. There is no such thing as clear development of colonial policy at the time. But they created chronology that remained in science ever since nowadays. So this is something that, I mean, as I said at the beginning, I'm not the expertise and public opinion is the crisis of knowledge is in a way something that for me almost came tangentially through this research. So, but this for me looks like a chance to be much more ready to, in a way, spot how production of knowledge can actually have ulterior motives. And I'm not claiming that I don't want to be like my protagonist to use the big words, but even if we are able to be more receptive for these tiny details that actually have some kind of a hidden intention behind it, that's enough for me. I mean, at least for my contribution.
Right.
I think we have one more question from Egon, and that will probably bring us to an end. So Egon.
Thanks very much. No, I mean, I'm fascinated by this idea, a lot of the ideas you're putting forward. And I've always been interested in sort of the unofficial or informal role of universities in the modern state. Like what you're kind of describing here is the process of how the university becomes, a key institution of well, maybe not the state, but what I'm intrigued by is one of the reasons why you're given why the university is becoming the important site of knowledge production versus, well, I suppose the Royal Societies and so on, is what I think you're saying, you're suggesting that this is to do with the expansion of the electorate or the democratization of governance in Britain. And what I find interesting is that the university becomes the site of knowledge production that tries to deal with this, to try to educate the electorate, even though, you know, at this point, the universities are still quite elitist, no? I mean, I'm reminded of in Yes Minister, when someone goes, don't we live in a democracy? And the response is, yes, but it's a British democracy, or, you know. So yeah, I was wondering if you could comment on that. Am I getting your angle correct? Like, is this, is this a story of how the university becomes the central academic unit, and why that might be?
Okay, I would like to start my answer by retorting with a quote from Yes Minister, and that it's important to preserve the universities, both of them. So I think that this story is about democracy because the electorate is being widened. So in 1980 in Britain, all men older than 20 and all women older than 30 have the right to vote. From 1884, it was around 80% of males older than 20 or 21, sorry, maybe I've missed. And I think this is one part of that. This is one part of the story. I think the other part of the story is actually growing literacy. And that Britain reaches the point where 50% of the population is literate around the middle of the 19th century. But then the question emerges actually, and there are only 2 universities. So in early 19th century, it's interesting. Scotland has 4 universities, England has only 2. So the question emerges, who will actually take care of this working class that slowly has the means and the chance to actually get education? So who will in a way create a program of that? Because actually it was pretty chaotic. There was no system. So David said that people in various places learn different history. Well, in the middle of the 19th century, it was also true for England. Depending from what kind of school you went, you would have different, so there is no centralized program. So in that sense, I think it's a mixture of both. One of the interesting organizations that existed in this period was called Workers' Education Association. And they actually gave their leaders actually participated strongly in international relations as a discipline because they had this background thought of kind of educating those who will get the chance to vote for the first time. But actually their, in a way, worries were not that founded because when Labour Party first became part of the government, they also took the colonial ministry. So which is kind of ironic for the whole fear of how will actually workers consider empire.
Okay, well, I thank you very much, Miloš. That was a very fascinating talk with a lot of information and very useful. So let's have a nice round of applause and thank you to the people who asked questions. And we'll meet again in about a month's time. We'll see everybody then. By then, maybe we'll be doing hybrid at least rather than straight Zoom. All right, bye everybody for now. Thanks.
Ciao.